the singing stopped him cold. Harlan Barlow had been meaning to walk past the doorway, meaning to grab his coat from the hook beside the hearth, meaning to do a dozen practical things that a man with 2 grieving children and a failing cattle operation had no business neglecting. But the moment that voice drifted out through the half-open door of his children's room, his boots went traitor on him, and he could not move another inch. It was low and sweet and full of something that had no business being in his house. Not sorrow exactly, though there was sorrow in it. Not hope exactly, though hope was threaded through it like gold wire through dark cloth. It was the sound of a woman who had known suffering and had decided, quietly and without anyone's permission, not to be destroyed by it. His daughter Clara, who was 7 years old and had not said more than 12 consecutive words to any living soul since her mother died 8 months ago, was laughing softly. His son Eli, who was 9 and had taken to sleeping with a hunting knife under his pillow, because he had decided that the world was a place that required constant armed vigilance, was making a sound. Harlan had not heard from him in so long that it took him a full 3 seconds to identify it. Eli was humming along. Harlan Barlow stood in that doorway with his coat forgotten, and his chest split open like a fault line after an earthquake, and he did not know whether what he was feeling was gratitude or terror, or something far more dangerous than either. He pressed his shoulder against the doorframe, and he looked at Myrtle Langston, who sat on the edge of Clara's narrow bed with a candle burning on the nightstand beside her, and he understood that he was in a great deal of trouble. She had arrived 14 days ago in response to the advertisement he had placed in the Abilene newspaper in a moment of pure desperation. Housekeeper wanted, 2 children, remote ranch, steady wages. He had kept the language flat and practical because he was a flat and practical man, or had been once, before grief had carved him hollow. He had expected someone matronly, someone with thick arms and a no-nonsense expression, and absolutely no capacity to make him feel as though the ground beneath his feet was unreliable. Myrtle Langston was 26 years old and had arrived with a single carpetbag, steady gray eyes, and a history she had volunteered nothing about. She was not what he expected. She was not anything he had prepared for. And now she was sitting in his children's room in the candlelight, singing something low and tender that he did not recognize, and his 2 wounded children were curling toward her like plants toward sunlight. And Harlan Barlow, who had survived a war and a prairie fire and the death of his wife, felt something crack open in the center of his chest that he was very much afraid he was never going to be able to close again. He made himself step back. He made himself be quiet about it. He went and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and did not light a lamp, and he thought about all the ways this was going to end badly, and how thoroughly he was going to have to guard himself against it. He was not very convincing, even to himself. Myrtle Langston had come to Barlow Ranch in the spring of 1878 with $43 sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt, a reference letter from a minister in Wichita who had known her family, and a secret that she had been carrying for 2 years that had made her very careful about where she set down roots. The secret was this: she had testified against a man named Cyrus Dodd in a federal court in Wichita in the spring of 1876. Cyrus Dodd was a cattle broker with connections to half the corrupt land offices in Kansas, and he had been orchestrating a scheme that defrauded homesteaders out of their land titles and had, in one particularly ugly incident, been responsible for the burning of a farmstead that had killed 2 people. Myrtle had worked as a bookkeeper for one of the companies Dodd used as a front, and she had seen the ledgers. She had understood what they meant. And when a deputy U.S. Marshal named Creed had come asking quiet questions, she had told him what she knew. Dodd had been convicted. He had gone to the territorial prison in Leavenworth. And 6 months later, 2 men had come to the boarding house where Myrtle was living and had informed her, in very specific and physical terms, that Cyrus Dodd had friends who had long memories and no patience for women who forgot their place. She had left Wichita the next morning. She had spent the following 2 years moving carefully, taking work where she could find it, never staying long enough to become known, never building anything she could not abandon in an hour. She had worked as a seamstress in Dodge City for 4 months. She had kept books for a dry goods store in Newton for 6 weeks before the owner's wife became suspicious of her husband's attention, and she had thought it best to move on. She had taught school for 1 semester in a small town called Meridian that was too small to appear on most maps, which was exactly why she had liked it, until the school board ran out of funds and let her go. She was tired of running. She was tired of sleeping light and watching doors, and never letting herself want anything that required staying put to have it. The advertisement had been in a week-old newspaper she had found in the Abilene Stage Depot. She had read it 3 times. Remote ranch. The remoteness was attractive for reasons she could not explain to a prospective employer. 2 children. She had always been good with children, had grown up in a large family, and had essentially raised her 2 youngest siblings after her mother's health declined. Steady wages. She had $43 in prospects that were narrowing. She wrote the letter. She sent it. She received a reply within 10 days, written in a hand that was spare and precise and revealed almost nothing about the man behind it except that he was not a man who wasted words. She wrote back. He wrote back. They agreed on terms. And she had climbed down from the Barlow Creek stage with her carpetbag in the dust of a late April afternoon and found Harlan Barlow waiting with a wagon and an expression that told her he had been expecting someone entirely different. He was not what she had expected either. She had pictured someone older, someone rumpled and defeated, worn down by the specific weight of being a man alone with children, and no idea how to manage the softness they still needed. She had pictured someone she could feel safe being employed by, which meant, if she was honest with herself, someone she would never be in danger of finding interesting. Harlan Barlow was 34 years old with dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples, a jaw that had seen a few disputes, and eyes the color of the Kansas sky in October, which was to say a deep and complicated blue that could turn cold without warning. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to look at him, and he carried himself with the particular economy of a man who had learned at some point that unnecessary movement was a form of weakness. He had looked at her for a long, assessing moment and then said, "Miss Langston," and shaken her hand, and put her bag in the wagon, and that had been the entirety of their introduction. The ranch was 12 miles outside of Barlow Creek, which was itself a town of perhaps 300 souls at generous count. The land was beautiful in a severe way, rolling grassland broken by cedar breaks and creek bottoms, wide sky pressing down from every direction. The house was solid, built of limestone and cedar, bigger than she had expected, built by a man who had meant his family to grow into it. There was a kitchen garden that had gone somewhat to weeds, a barn, a bunkhouse where 2 ranch hands named Tomas and Pete lived, and a general atmosphere of a place that was being maintained but not loved. The children had been waiting on the porch steps. Clara had stared at her with enormous dark eyes and said nothing. Eli had looked her up and down with a 9-year-old's unsparing assessment and said, "You're not very old." "No," Myrtle had agreed. "Neither are you." Something had shifted slightly in his expression, not warmth exactly, more like the adjustment of a preliminary estimate. Harlan had shown her the house with the same spare efficiency he had shown in his letters. Kitchen, pantry, the children's room, her room, which was small but private and had a good lock on the door, which she had noted with relief she had been careful not to show. He had explained the household routine, the meals he expected, the tasks that needed doing. He had been precise and impersonal, and she had been grateful for both qualities. What she had not been prepared for was the grief that lived in that house like a 5th resident. Ellen Barlow had died in August of the previous year, 8 months before Myrtle arrived. She had died of a fever that had taken hold after a miscarriage and had not let go. She had been 31 years old. Her photograph was on the mantelpiece in the sitting room, A serious-faced woman with Clara's eyes and Eli's stubborn set to her jaw, and Myrtle had understood from the first moment she saw it that she was stepping into a wound that had not yet begun to close. She had been careful. She had been proper. She had kept the house and cooked the meals and washed the clothes and done it all with a brisk professional competence that she hoped communicated clearly that she was not here to replace anyone or fill any space that was not hers to fill. She was an employee. She had a job to do. She kept her distance from Harlan Barlow, who in any case seemed to actively prefer distance, who worked from before dawn until after dark and came to meals tired and silent, and looked at his children with an expression of helpless love and terror that he clearly did not know anyone could see. But the children were a different matter. Clara had come to her on the third evening, while Myrtle was washing dishes, and had stood beside her and said nothing for 10 minutes, and then picked up a dish towel and begun to dry without being asked. Myrtle had said thank you and nothing else and had let that be enough, and something had eased between them like a door coming slightly off the latch. Eli was harder and more worth the effort. He tested her constantly, with small defiances and large ones, with silence and with pointed challenges, and she met every one of them with the same steady patience and refusal to be either baited or defeated. On the 7th day he had come to her with a broken harness strap, and an expression of deliberate nonchalance that meant he was testing whether she would send him to his father or help him. And she had sat down with him at the kitchen table and spent an hour showing him how to mend leather with an awl and a waxed thread. And after that something between them had shifted to something that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of trust. On the 11th evening she had gone to their room to say good night, as she had begun doing, and Clara had asked if she knew any songs. Myrtle had sat down on the edge of the bed and sung the first song that came to mind, which was an old one her grandmother had sung, a slow and gentle thing about rivers and traveling and coming home, and Clara had gone still and wide-eyed, and Eli, from his bed across the room, had gone very quiet in a way that was different from his usual defensive quiet. On the 12th evening she had come back and sung again without being asked. On the 14th evening Harlan Barlow had stood in that doorway and heard her, and something in him had come undone at the seams, and she had not known he was there. She found out the next morning. She was in the kitchen at first light building up the cook fire, when she heard his boots on the back steps, and then he was in the doorway and she looked up and something in his face was different. He had the look of a man who had spent a sleepless night arguing with himself and had not won. "Miss Langston," he said. "Mr. Barlow," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He came in and hung his hat on the hook and sat down at the table, which he did not ordinarily do at this hour. He was usually halfway to the south pasture by now. "The children," he said, then stopped. She waited. She had learned that he needed room to find his words. "They seem better," he said, "these past 2 weeks. Clara spoke at supper last night, more than she has in months, and Eli," he stopped again. "I heard him humming this morning. He has a good ear," she said. Harlan looked at her. There was something careful happening behind his eyes, something he was actively working to keep contained. "What you're doing with them," he said, "I want you to know I see it." "I'm not doing anything extraordinary," she said. "I'm just here." "That," he said quietly, "is the extraordinary part." She did not know what to do with that. She turned back to the fire and was glad of an excuse to have her face turned away from him, because something had happened to her expression that she did not want him to see. He sat there a while longer, drinking the coffee she poured for him, and neither of them spoke, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. That was the part that frightened her. It was a silence that felt like something being built, and she was not sure she could afford to live in whatever it was they were building. May came in on a week of good weather and hard work. The spring calving was in full swing, and Harlan and his 2 hands were working themselves half to death in the south and east pastures, coming in for meals with mud to their knees and exhaustion sitting heavy on their shoulders. Myrtle ran the house, kept the children, managed the kitchen garden, put up preserves from the early berries, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she was not unhappy. She was watchful. She was always watchful. That was the habit of 2 years of careful living. She noticed the men who stopped at the ranch from time to time, the neighbors, the supply wagon from Barlow Creek, a circuit preacher who came through once a month, and she cataloged them without appearing to, checking faces against the faces of the men who had come to her boarding house in Wichita. None of them matched. She was probably safe here. Probably. But she had stopped being sure that safety was the only thing she was thinking about when she lay awake at night. Harlan Barlow was in her thoughts more than she could justify by any practical accounting. She told herself it was because he was her employer, and she needed to understand him to do her job well. She told herself it was because she was concerned about the children, and he was central to understanding the children. She told herself a great many things that were partially true and entirely insufficient. The truth was simpler and more inconvenient. She was drawn to him the way she had not been drawn to anyone in a very long time, with a pull that was specific and persistent, and ignored all the very good reasons she had to keep herself at a safe professional distance. She watched him with his children and felt something turn over in her chest. He was not an easy man. He did not have the natural warmth that some fathers had, the easy playfulness that made children feel immediately comfortable. His love for Eli and Clara was enormous and visible, and he had absolutely no idea how to reach across the grief that had grown up between them like a wall since Ellen died. He tried. She could see him trying every day, sitting down with Eli after supper to ask about his day, kneeling beside Clara to look at whatever small thing had caught her attention. He was patient and earnest and slightly clumsy about it, in the way that people are clumsy when they are terrified of getting something wrong, and it was the most human thing she had ever seen. On a Thursday in the second week of May, the supply wagon came from Barlow Creek, and the driver, a cheerful man named Wick who talked more than anyone Myrtle had met in her considerable experience of talkative people, brought the week's post along with the flour and salt and coffee. There was a letter for Harlan from his brother in Colorado. There was a bill from the feed merchant. And there was a letter with no return address, postmarked Wichita, addressed to Miss M. Langston in a hand she recognized immediately. Her stomach dropped to somewhere near her boots. She took it to her room and opened it with steady hands she was proud of. It was from Deputy Marshal Creed. It was not long. Creed was not a man who wasted paper. He wrote that Cyrus Dodd had been released from Leavenworth 3 weeks ago on a legal technicality that Creed clearly found infuriating. He wrote that Dodd had made inquiries, and that those inquiries had led toward Kansas, and that some of those inquiries had included, specifically, a description of Myrtle. He wrote that she should be careful, and that if she needed to contact him, she could reach him through the U.S. Marshal's office in Dodge City. He wrote that he was sorry. She sat on the edge of her bed with the letter in her hands and thought about $43 sewn into a hem and a carpetbag she had not fully unpacked. Then she heard Clara's voice from the kitchen, bright and specific, calling her name, and she heard Eli saying something that made Clara laugh. And she folded the letter very precisely, tucked it into the interior pocket of her carpetbag, and went back to her life. She did not tell Harlan. She did not tell anyone. She told herself she could manage this. She had been managing it for 2 years. She knew how to be careful. What she had not accounted for was the specific difficulty of being careful while also, against all her better intentions, falling in love. It happened in degrees, the way the best and worst things tend to happen, not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of moments that each seemed small in isolation and were catastrophic in their sum. It was the morning he came in early from checking the north fence line, because Clara had scraped her knee badly, and Myrtle had sent Tomas to fetch him, and he had ridden in at a speed that told her everything she needed to know about the space his children occupied in him. It was the evening she had been in the kitchen garden past dark, fighting a particularly stubborn stand of bindweed, and he had come out with a lantern without being asked and held it steady while she worked. And they had talked, really talked, for the first time, about nothing particularly important, about the garden and the weather, and whether the cedar brake to the south was good for deer. And it had been the finest conversation she had had in 2 years. It was the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she could not see, which was a look she recognized because she had been working very hard not to look at him the same way. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of May, with a hot wind coming from the southwest and the smell of coming rain in the air, when the thing that had been building between them arrived at a kind of crisis that could no longer be quietly ignored. She had been in the barn, checking on a mare that had been off her feed, when she heard him come in behind her. She did not turn around. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, with a precision that she found both useful and deeply inconvenient. "She's eating better," Myrtle said, not turning. "I think it was the heat." "Myrtle," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She turned. He was standing in the barn doorway with the afternoon light at his back, and he had an expression on his face that she had not seen before, something stripped of its usual careful management. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was not entirely sure it was the right one but had made it anyway. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "All right," she said. "Are you planning to leave?" She was quiet. Outside, the wind shifted and the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. "What makes you ask?" she said carefully. "Because you're not fully here," he said. "You're here in every way that counts, with the children, with the work, all of it. But there's something you're holding back, something you're watching for. And I've been trying to mind my own business about it, but I find I can't anymore." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter in her carpet bag. She thought about Cyrus Dodd with his long memory and his dangerous friends. She thought about what it would mean to tell him and what it would mean not to. "I'm not planning to leave," she said, which was true. "But something is wrong," he said, which was also true. "Mr. Barlow," she said. "Harlan," he said. She took a breath. "Harlan, I appreciate your concern. But there are things in my history that are mine to manage. I don't want you to worry on my behalf." "It's a little late for that," he said quietly. The thunder came again, closer, and the first fat drops of rain began to hit the barn roof overhead. He did not move from the doorway, and she did not move from where she was standing, and the space between them was charged with something that had nothing to do with the weather. "I'm not in immediate danger," she said, which she believed to be currently true. "I've been careful, I know how to be careful." Something crossed his face that was almost anger, but softer than anger, more like pain. "You shouldn't have to be careful," he said. "Not here. Not on this ranch." "Harlan, tell me," he said. "Whatever it is, tell me and let me help." She told him. She told him all of it. Cyrus Dodd and the ledgers and the federal court and the men at the boarding house and 2 years of moving and the letter that had come on Thursday. She told him in the barn with the rain beginning to fall hard on the roof and the mare shifting in her stall and the afternoon light going gray and dim around them. She told him more than she had told anyone, more than she had told Marshal Creed even, because Creed had needed facts and Harlan, she realized as she spoke, needed to understand her, which was a different and more intimate thing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "This Dodd," he said, "he's been released 3 weeks ago, and his people are asking after you." "That's what Creed wrote," he nodded slowly. He was thinking with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, working the problem with a kind of controlled intensity that she found, absurdly, was making her feel safer than she had in years. "You're not leaving," he said. "It was not a question. I told you I wasn't planning to." "I'm not asking about planning," he said. "I'm saying you're not leaving, you're staying, and we'll sort this out. Harlan, these are dangerous men." "I know dangerous men," he said, in a tone that quietly closed that particular line of argument. She looked at him in the gray barn light, this spare and complicated man who had not asked her if she needed help but had simply decided she was going to have it, and she felt something shift in her chest that she was fairly certain was permanent. You have enough to worry about, she said, because she felt she ought to say it. I do, he agreed. And now I'm adding this. That's my choice to make. They stood there in the rain sound for another long moment, and then he said, I'll write to the marshal's office in Dodge City tomorrow. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to. He wrote the letter the next morning before dawn. She knew because she was up early herself and heard the scratch of his pen at the kitchen table while she was dressing. And when she came out, he was folding the letter and sealing it with a steady hand, and he looked up at her, and something passed between them that neither of them put words to yet. Tomas took the letter to town that afternoon when he went for supplies. The reply came 8 days later, and it was from Creed himself, who had apparently ridden to Barlow Creek specifically to talk to Harlan in person, rather than put anything more in writing. And Myrtle came home from the kitchen garden to find a lean, weathered man in a federal marshal's coat, sitting at the kitchen table drinking her coffee like he had been there for years. Creed was in his mid-40s, with a face like old saddle leather and eyes that missed very little. He shook her hand with a businesslike firmness and said, Miss Langston, I'm glad you're not dead. So am I, she said. He laid out what he knew. Dodd was in Kansas City, not yet in the area, but he had sent 2 men west, brothers named Wills, who had done work for him before. Creed had a federal warrant in progress, but warrants took time and men who held grudges did not always wait for legal processes to catch up with them. What I'm recommending, Creed said, is that you stay put and let me work the problem from my end. Running won't help you at this point. They know roughly where you are. Moving will just put you on the road, which is harder to protect. She's staying, Harlan said, which was not precisely Creed's call to make, but Creed looked at him with a careful expression and seemed to decide it was not worth arguing. Creed stayed 2 days at the ranch, sleeping in the bunkhouse, talking to Harlan at length about the Wills brothers and their known habits and methods, and when he left he said he would be in contact and asked Harlan to send word immediately if anything seemed wrong. The days after Creed's departure had a particular quality of suspended tension that Myrtle found oddly clarifying. She had been living with fear for 2 years as a background condition, a low, constant hum that she had learned to work around and ignore. Having it acknowledged and addressed openly was different. It was still frightening. But it was frightening in a way that felt shared rather than solitary, and that was a difference she had not expected to feel so profoundly. Harlan changed certain things on the ranch without making a production of it. He rearranged the watch so that someone was always in the barn or the yard at night. He started keeping his rifle closer at hand. He showed her, quietly one morning, where he kept a spare revolver in the pantry and how it was loaded and how to use it, which she already knew because her father had taught her. But she let him show her because he needed to do something and this was practical. He also started appearing at the kitchen door in the evenings more frequently, after the children were in bed, ostensibly to get a cup of coffee or to check something that didn't need checking. They had started talking. Really talking, the way that people talk when the pretense of formal distance has been stripped away by something larger and more urgent. She told him about her family in Missouri, her parents, her siblings, the younger 2 she had helped raise. He told her about the war, briefly and without detail but enough. He told her about coming west afterward, about buying the land, about Ellen, about what it had been like to build something, and then have the center of it taken out. She listened without flinching, and without the excessive sympathy that she suspected he would have found unbearable. She just listened, and sometimes she asked a question that showed she had understood what he was not quite saying, and he looked at her when she did that with an expression that she had stopped trying to categorize. On a warm evening in early June he came in from the yard while she was washing the last of the supper dishes, and he stood at the other end of the kitchen and said, "I need to tell you something." She looked up. "This arrangement," he said, "the way things are here, it isn't going to be adequate much longer." She set down the dish she was washing. Her heartbeat was doing something complicated. "Meaning," she said, Meaning that I am aware that you are my employee and that there are proper boundaries that should apply, and I have been trying very sincerely to observe them." He paused. His jaw tightened slightly. "I find I am no longer succeeding." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the creek frogs had started up their evening noise, and somewhere to the west a coyote called once and went silent. "Harlan," she said. "I'm not asking you to do anything," he said quickly. "I'm not putting you in a position where you feel your situation here depends on anything. I want to be very clear about that. Your place in this house, your wages, your safety, none of that is conditional on anything you feel or don't feel. I just can't continue pretending that what I feel is something I don't feel." She looked at him for a long time. He was standing very still, the way he stood when he was holding something difficult. "What do you feel?" she said. He looked at her with those October blue eyes and said, "I think you know." "I'd like to hear it," she said. "I care about you," he said, and it came out quiet and unadorned and entirely serious. "More than is professionally appropriate, more than I expected. And I think about you considerably more than is wise, and when something happens on this ranch that is good, you are the first person I want to tell." She had been gripping the edge of the sink, she realized. She made herself let go. "Harlan," she said, "I am in a complicated situation. There are men looking for me. My past is not something I can simply explain away in a single conversation. I am your employee, and the practical difficulties of that are real." "Yes," he said. "And I feel the same way," she said. He was quiet for one long moment. Then something in his face changed, not dramatically, not with any theatrical flourish, just a subtle and profound easing, like a man who has been holding a breath for a very long time and has finally let it go. "All right," he said. "Then we'll manage the complicated situation, and we'll manage the practical difficulties, and we'll take the rest one day at a time." "That's a very calm way to describe it," she said. "I'm a very calm man," he said. "No," she said, "you're not. You're a man who works very hard at appearing calm." He looked at her for a moment, and then something happened that she had not seen before. He smiled. It changed his whole face, cracked open the careful reserve, and showed her something warm and rueful and unexpectedly beautiful. "You see too much," he said. "I see what's there," she said. They were in June and July now, and the world had shifted into something new and still somewhat careful, but warm with a warmth that had been earning itself over weeks of shared mornings, and shared suppers and long evenings in which they sat sometimes on the porch after the children were in bed and watched the stars come out over the grassland and talked, or did not talk as the mood required. He was not an easy man to know quickly. He was layered and guarded and built on a foundation of losses that had taught him to be cautious about what he let himself want. But he was steady. He was the steadiest person she had ever encountered, in the way that certain landforms are steady, shaped by enormous forces and permanent for it. And he was kind in ways he seemed almost unaware of, the way he noticed things, the way he paid attention, the way he never asked her to be something she was not. She told him more about her life in Missouri. She told him about the courtship that had come to nothing 4 years ago. A man in Wichita she had been genuinely fond of, who had discovered that she had more opinions and more independence than he had been expecting, and had retreated in confusion. She told him about the bookkeeping work, how she had been good at it, how she had liked the clarity of numbers in a world that was often unclear. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he gave everything, entire and present, and when she was finished, he said that numbers were clarifying and that he could understand why she had liked them. She told him about the night she had decided to testify. He listened to that with particular care. "You did the right thing," he said. "I know," she said. "I've never doubted that. I've only doubted whether I'd survive it." "You will," he said, and the certainty in his voice was not bravado. It was something more like a statement of intent. "We'll make sure of it." The children were watching the shift between them with the particular acuity that children apply to the adults they love and depend on. Clara, cautiously hopeful, began to include Myrtle in drawings she brought home from her lessons with the circuit teacher who visited the area. The drawings included a woman with dark hair, and a specific face that was clearly meant to be Myrtle standing beside what was clearly meant to be their house. Myrtle had looked at that drawing for a long time after Clara had moved on to other things. Eli was more complicated about it, which she understood. He was 9 years old and he had loved his mother, and his mother was gone. And here was this woman who was becoming important to everyone in a way that could feel like displacement. She did not push him. She did not try to accelerate anything or fill any space he was not ready to have filled. She just continued to be present and consistent and interested in him specifically, in the particular person that Eli Barlow was, which was sharp and brave and deeply loyal, and working very hard to be harder than he needed to be. One afternoon in the middle of June, she found him behind the barn, sitting with his back against the limestone wall, and when she came around the corner she saw that he had been crying and was working hard to stop. She sat down beside him, not too close, and looked out at the grassland and said nothing. After a while he said, "I miss her." "I know," she said. "Sometimes I think I'm forgetting what she looked like," he said, "and then I hate myself for it." "You're not forgetting her," she said. "You're just living far enough from it that the sharp parts get less sharp. That's not forgetting, that's surviving." He was quiet. "She wouldn't want you to suffer," she said. "I didn't know her, but I know she wouldn't." "Papa says that too," he said. "Your papa is right about a lot of things," she said. He looked at her then directly with that 9-year-old's unsparing eye. "Do you like my papa?" he said. She was quiet for one honest moment. "Yes," she said. "I like your papa very much." He nodded as if something had been confirmed. Then he said, "He likes you too. He looks at you different than he looks at other people." "Does he?" she said. "Yeah," Eli said. "He looks at you like you're something he doesn't want to lose." She had to work very hard to keep her voice steady when she said, "Well, that's good to know." The crisis, when it came on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of July, on a day that had been hot and still from morning, the kind of day that pressed down on everything and made the horses nervous and the cattle bunch up at the creek. Myrtle had taken the children into town that morning in the wagon to pick up a parcel at the mercantile and some thread she needed, leaving Harlan and the hands working on the south pasture fence. It was the most exposed she had been in weeks, and she had been watchful the whole way in, scanning the road and the creek bottoms and the clusters of cedar. But the ride in had been uneventful, and she had begun to relax. The town of Barlow Creek was the kind of small western town that existed in 1878 all across the Kansas grassland. A main street of weathered board buildings, a mercantile, a livery, a small hotel, a saloon, a church that doubled as the schoolroom, and a telegraph office that was also the postal station. She knew most of the people by sight now after 2 months. The mercantile owner Harding and his wife, the livery man Walsh, several of the ranch families from the area. She was at the mercantile counter waiting for her parcel when she felt it. The particular prickling at the back of her neck that she had learned to trust absolutely, the sense of being watched with focused intent rather than the casual attention of a public street. She turned slowly, as though she were simply looking at the goods on the shelves, and let her eyes move carefully across the room. There were 2 men at the far end of the counter. They had the look of men who had been traveling hard and had not bothered to clean up at the hotel before doing their business. They were looking at the shelf behind her. One of them glanced at her and then away, a careful studied casualness that was very slightly too careful. She kept her breathing even. She collected her parcel. She found the children who were looking at the penny candy display near the door. She said, quietly and naturally, "I've decided we'll head home now. I've got everything I need." She took each of them by the hand and walked out into the sunlight. She loaded them into the wagon with a speed she kept from looking like urgency. She took the reins and pulled out of the main street and onto the Barlow Creek Road, and she drove at a reasonable pace for a 1/4 mile, until she was around the first bend and out of sight of the town, and then she pushed the horse faster. They were a mile from the ranch when she heard the hoofbeats behind her. She pushed the horse harder. She did not explain to the children what was happening, but Clara had gone very still, and Eli was looking back over his shoulder with a face that had gone pale and sharp. "Eli," she said, "hold on to your sister and hold on to the seat and don't let go for any reason." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was no 9-year-old in his voice at all. She got to the ranch yard at a pace that brought Tomas running from the barn and Pete from the bunkhouse, and she was out of the wagon before it fully stopped, and she said to Tomas, "There are 2 men on the road behind me, and I believe they followed me from town. Go get Harlan. Fast." Then she got the children inside and barred the door and retrieved the revolver from the pantry and checked that it was fully loaded. Tomas had gone for Harlan at a dead run across the south pasture. The 2 riders came into the yard at a deliberate pace, not hurried, not aggressive on the surface, but there was a quality to the way they sat their horses that she recognized. Pete was standing in the yard with his rifle, which had given them pause. Harlan came from the south pasture at a canter, and she heard him talking to them from inside, his voice carrying the tone of a man who was entirely in control of the situation and who was indicating clearly that this was his land. She stood at the window and watched. She could not hear the exact words. She watched the exchange, the 2 men and Harlan, and she watched the way the men's eyes kept moving toward the house, and Harlan kept positioning himself between them and the house, and she thought about how she had spent 2 years running from this, and how she was done running. She went to the front door and opened it. Harlan turned and looked at her. One of the men looked at her with sudden recognition, and that told her everything she needed to know. These were the Wills brothers. These were Dodd's men. The taller one said, "Miss Langston, Mr. Dodd would like a word." "Mr. Dodd can address any words he has to the federal marshal's office in Dodge City," she said, "where his warrant is currently being processed." There was a silence. The tall one looked at his brother. Harlan said, in a very quiet voice, "I'm going to ask you both to turn your horses around and ride back to wherever you came from. If you come onto this property again, I will interpret that as a threat to the people in this house, and I will respond accordingly. I would encourage you to communicate that clearly to your employer." The taller one looked at him for a long moment, calculating. Harlan met his eyes without moving. They left. She watched them go down the road until they were small and then gone, and then she sat down in the kitchen because her legs had decided they were done holding her up. Harlan came in a minute later. He looked at her sitting at the table with the revolver in her hand, and he sat down across from her and said, "Are the children all right?" "They're in their room. They're fine." She set the revolver on the table. "You were magnificent." "I was extremely anxious," he said, "but thank you." She laughed, which was a slightly unsteady sound, and he looked at her, and something in his face shifted, and he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and that was the first time he had touched her in anything that was not accidental, and she turned her hand over and held on. "Creed needs to know immediately," he said. "I know," she said. "They'll come back." "They won't find it comfortable," he said grimly. He sent a rider to Dodge City that afternoon. Creed arrived 2 days later with another marshal in tow, and the arrest of the Wills brothers, who had been located at the hotel in Barlow Creek, happened quickly and without further drama. They were taken back to Dodge City to face charges that, when added to the existing charges against Dodd, were significant enough to give his lawyers considerable difficulty. It took 6 more weeks and a letter from Creed in August that was longer than his usual style, but the news when it came was definitive. Cyrus Dodd had been returned to Leavenworth, this time on charges serious enough that his lawyers were not optimistic about another early release. The Wills brothers had offered testimony in exchange for consideration of their own charges, and that testimony had added considerably to the case against Dodd. Creed wrote at the end of his letter, in a postscript that she suspected cost him some effort, "You appear to have landed somewhere good, Miss Langston. I'm glad of it." She had stood in the August sunshine reading that letter and felt the particular lightness of something that has been heavy for a very long time finally being set down. She went to find Harlan. He was in the barn. She could hear him talking to one of the horses in the low, steady voice he used with animals, and she stood in the barn doorway, which seemed to her an appropriate reversal, and said his name. He turned. She held up the letter. He read it in the barn light with his brow slightly furrowed, reading carefully the way he did everything, and when he looked up his face was open in a way that she had come to recognize as what he looked like when he was not being careful. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he said. She took the letter back and folded it, and then she did not know quite what to do with her hands. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I want to be honest about it, even though honesty about these things is somewhat outside my usual practice." He waited. "I came here because I needed a place to be safe," she said. "That was my primary motivation, and I will not pretend otherwise. But something happened here that I was not expecting and did not plan for and cannot claim to have been entirely wise about." "Myrtle," he said. "I love you," she said. "I want to be clear about it. Not the general affection of someone who is grateful for shelter. Not the fondness of an employee for a reasonable employer. I love you in the way that means I want to be here when you are here, and I want to know how you are when you are not, and I think about your children as though they are already mine even though they are not. And I think about this place as though it is home even though I came here as a stranger. And all of that is yours to do what you like with. I just needed to say it plainly." He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, and then he was holding her face in both his hands, gentle and certain, and he said, "Myrtle Langston, I have been in love with you since the night I stood in the doorway and heard you sing to my children and couldn't move a single step for the weight of it." She was quiet for a moment, looking up at him. "You were in the doorway," she said. "I was undone," he said simply. She reached up and put her hands over his where they cupped her face. "Well," she said, "that's a good place to start." He kissed her in the barn with the August light coming through the gaps in the cedar boards, and the horses shuffling in their stalls, and the grassland going gold in the late afternoon sun. And it was not a tentative kiss or a polite kiss, but a thorough and sincere one that communicated everything that had been building since April with a clarity that made words seem briefly redundant. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers and said, "I want to do this properly." "You are doing it properly," she said. "I mean ask you properly," he said. "When you've had some time, when things have settled, I know you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and I don't want to rush you into anything." "Harlan," she said. "Yes." "Ask me now," she said. "I have been patient and careful for 2 years and I am done being cautious about the things I want." He laughed, a genuine laugh, warm and slightly surprised. Then he said with a gravity that she knew was entirely sincere, "Will you marry me, Myrtle Langston? Will you stay here on this land with me and with these children who already love you and make this your home?" "Yes," she said, without any qualification whatsoever. "Yes." They told the children that evening. Clara looked between them for a long moment and then climbed directly into Myrtle's lap and buried her face against Myrtle's shoulder, and Myrtle held her and felt her heart so full it was almost painful. Eli sat at the table with his hands folded and his expression serious and finally said, "Does this mean you're staying for always?" "For always," Harlan said. Eli nodded. Then he said to Myrtle, "Good, because Clara cries sometimes at night when she thinks no one can hear. She does it less now, since you came." Myrtle looked at him and said, "Thank you for telling me that, Eli." He shrugged, with the elaborate nonchalance of a boy trying very hard not to show how much he cared. "I just thought you should know," he said. They were married in September of 1878 in the church in Barlow Creek, on a clear, cool day with the grassland turning gold around the town and a sky so blue it ached to look at. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, attended by Tomas and Pete, and old Harding from the Mercantile, and his wife, and a scattering of the neighboring ranch families who had come to know Myrtle over the summer. She wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool, not a traditional wedding dress but good quality and fitted, and she had added a collar of white lace that she had made herself over the past 3 weeks. She wore her grandmother's brooch at the collar. She carried a small bunch of late summer wildflowers that Clara had picked and arranged with fierce, careful attention. Harlan wore his good suit and had trimmed his beard, and he looked at her when she came through the church door with an expression that she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. They said the words. She meant every one of them. She watched him mean every one of his. Eli stood very straight beside his father, looking serious and proud. Clara stood beside Myrtle with her hand tucked into Myrtle's free hand throughout the ceremony and did not let go. Afterward, there was a modest celebration at the Mercantile. With food the women of the area had contributed, and someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing on the plank floor. Harlan danced with her once, slowly and without embarrassment about his approximate expertise, and she leaned into him and thought about the word home with a private precision. October came with a blue cold beauty that she had not experienced in Kansas before, the grassland going amber and russet, and the sky turning that deep shade that she now thought of as Harlan's eye color. She settled into being Mrs. Barlow with a private sense of amazement that this was real and continuing, that she was allowed to have it, that nothing was going to come and take it away. There was work, constant and varied and satisfying. She had Harlan help her reclaim the kitchen garden before the first frost, and they put up more preserves than the pantry had seen in years. She worked with him on the ranch books, applying her accounting skills to the operation's finances, and finding several places where they could improve their position with better management of the cattle sale timing. He was both surprised and visibly pleased by this, not because he had not thought her capable, but because he had not expected her to want to engage with that side of things. And she told him that she had always liked numbers, and he had said that he was very glad, and they had spent an entire evening at the kitchen table with the ledgers, and it had been one of the best evenings she could remember. She continued to sing to the children every night. It had become the cornerstone of their bedtime ritual, the thing they counted on, and she did not begrudge a single note of it. She had expanded her repertoire from the river song to a dozen others, and sometimes Clara requested specific ones, and sometimes Eli pretended he was not listening, and she could hear him humming along from his side of the room. Harlan stopped appearing in the doorway without knowing she had seen him. She knew he was there, most nights, for some portion of the singing. She let him stand there. She understood what it meant to him to hear his children settling into peace, and she understood what it meant to him to watch her give them that, and she was glad to be the source of it. He came to her one night after the children were asleep and found her in the kitchen and said, "You should know that the night I first heard you sing, I stood in that doorway for nearly 10 minutes and could not make myself move." "I know," she said. "You know." "I suspected," she said. "I felt you there." "I didn't say anything because I thought you needed it. You needed to hear that they were all right." He looked at her. "How do you do that?" he said. "See what people need when they can't see it themselves." "I was raised in a large family," she said. "You learn to read the room." He came and sat beside her at the kitchen table and took her hand in both of his the way he had in the barn that first summer, and he said, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I was afraid after Ellen," he said. "I was afraid that if I let myself feel anything again for anyone, I would be leaving myself open to being that undone again. The losing kind of undone, and so I was determined not to feel anything." "I know," she said. "And then you came," he said, "and it turned out determination had very little to do with it." "No," she agreed. "It generally doesn't." He raised her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, a gesture so tender that it made her chest ache. "I don't believe in regret as a rule," he said, "but if I had sent back your letter and hired someone else, I think that would have been the thing I regretted most in my life." "You wrote very efficient letters," she said, "but there was something about them that made me trust you, even before I met you." "What something?" he said, curious. "They were honest," she said. "They said exactly what was true and nothing more. You didn't dress the situation up. You said it was hard and remote, and that there were 2 children who needed looking after. Most men advertising for a housekeeper would have softened it. You didn't." "I didn't want to mislead anyone," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the part that made me trust you." Winter came to the Kansas grassland with a severity that reminded her why the prairies had never been friendly to the unprepared. November brought ice storms and December brought a blizzard that kept them inside for 4 days, which was, unexpectedly, one of the finest stretches of time she had known in years. They were snowbound and warm, the 4 of them and the 2 hands in the bunkhouse, and the world had shrunk to the size of the house and the barn and the distance between them, and she had found that this was exactly the right size for the world to be. Eli, freed by the snow from any obligation to maintain his dignity, had agreed to play card games at the kitchen table with a willingness that she suspected he would not have shown in better weather, and had been the most ferocious and gleeful snap player she had ever encountered. Clara had spent 2 days making a complex and increasingly ambitious snow scene with bits of cloth and twigs and small stones, and Harlan had sat beside her for hours on the sitting room floor helping her, his long frame folded up comfortably on the rug, and Myrtle had watched that and loved him with an uncomplicated and enormous happiness. On the 4th day of the blizzard, when the wind had dropped and the light through the snow-sheeted windows was white and still, he had found her alone in the sitting room and said, "Are you happy here?" She had looked at him, surprised by the question. "Yes," she said, "thoroughly. I ask because I know this is not an easy life," he said. "It's remote and hard, and you could have had something easier." "I could have had something safer," she said. "Not easier, there's a difference, and safe was never what I wanted most." "What did you want most?" he said. "This," she said simply, and spread her hands to include the room and the snow light and the house and the sound of Eli arguing cheerfully with Clara in the other room about something irrelevant. "Exactly this." Spring came again, and with it, a new season of calving and the garden and the expanding rhythms of a life that had taken root. She had begun teaching Clara to read music, having discovered that Clara had her grandmother's ear and a remarkable sensitivity to pitch, and the lessons had become one of the pleasures of her week. Eli had grown 2 inches over the winter and had begun working seriously alongside Tomas in the barn in the afternoons, learning the horsework with a focused intensity that made Harlan visibly proud. And in April, almost exactly a year after she had climbed down from the Barlow Creek stage with $43 and a secret, Myrtle told Harlan that they were expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before the household was fully awake, sitting at the kitchen table with the first coffee of the day in front of them both and the spring light beginning to come through the east window. She had known for 2 weeks and had been turning it over in her private thinking, making sure of it, and then making sure she was ready to have it be real and not just known. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face do something complicated and ultimately arrive at something that was beyond what she had words for. "When?" he said. "October," she said. "I think." He got up from the table and came around and gathered her against him with a gentleness that was also strength. The particular combination that she had come to understand was essentially who he was, and he held her for a long time and said nothing, and she felt him breathing slowly and steadily against her hair. "Are you happy?" she said, because she wanted to hear it. "I am," he said, "beyond my capacity to adequately express it." "You're doing well so far," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her face. "Are you all right? Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said, somewhat determined to be sick in the mornings but otherwise excellent. He looked at her with that expression she loved, the one that was warm and slightly helpless about being warm. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make the breakfast." "You burned the oatmeal last time you made the breakfast," she said. "I will exercise extreme vigilance," he said. "I'll sit down," she said, "and watch you exercise extreme vigilance." He did not burn the oatmeal. He burned the toast, but the oatmeal was fine, and he presented it with a formality that made her laugh. They told the children that evening. Clara's reaction was immediate and total. She wanted to name the baby Clara if it was a girl and had specific and detailed opinions about nursery arrangements that she began communicating at length. Eli listened to the announcement with his characteristic thoughtful quiet and then said, "Will it sleep in our room?" "Not at first," Harlan said. It'll be in a cradle in our room." "Good," Eli said, "because it'll be loud." "It will be," Myrtle agreed. Eli was quiet a moment longer and then said, in a tone of deliberate practicality that did not quite hide what was underneath it, "I've been thinking I could teach it things. When it's old enough. How to ride and how to mend leather and things like that. It would be lucky to have a teacher like you," she said. He nodded, as if this confirmed a plan he had already been working through. "Okay," he said. "Good." The months of the pregnancy moved with a combination of ordinary life and a specific quality of anticipation. Summer came golden and hard-worked and full. She was well enough through the summer, managing the nausea of the early months, and then feeling, by July, a physical brightness and energy that she channeled into the garden, and the house with a thoroughness that Harlan observed with both admiration and mild concern about whether she was overdoing it. She was not overdoing it. She was doing exactly as much as felt right, which was considerable, because she was a woman who needed to be occupied. He had learned this about her over a year of close observation and had accordingly made peace with it, though he watched her from the kitchen door sometimes with an expression that she caught and pointed out and told him to stop, and he said he was not worried, he was just looking, and she said they both knew that was not the complete truth, and he admitted that was fair. August was brutal with heat, and they got through it with the creek and the shade of the cedar brake, and a great deal of cold water hauled up from the well. She sat on the porch in the evenings with her feet up, and the breeze coming off the grassland, and sometimes Harlan sat beside her, and they watched the sun go down and said little, because there was very little that needed saying. She sang to the children every night through the summer and the early fall, even as her body changed, and she had to shift her position on the edge of Clara's bed. The songs had expanded over the months into a repertoire of considerable range, old songs and new ones, slow songs and livelier ones for the evenings when the children were wound up from the day and needed something with more rhythm to carry them down toward sleep. There were nights when Harlan stood in the doorway through the whole of it, leaning against the frame, watching his children and watching her, and she felt him there the way she always felt him, with that warm and specific awareness. One night in late September, 3 weeks before the baby was due, she looked up from the end of a song and found him still in the doorway with an expression that made her heart turn over in her chest. He looked at her across the room, across the candlelight and the sleeping children, and his face was entirely open, all the careful reserve gone, and what was there instead was something that she thought was probably the truest version of him, this man who had survived so much and had found his way back to love through grief, and through weariness, and through the patient accumulation of days shared with a woman who had come to his door with a carpetbag and a secret, and had stayed to become the center of everything. She pressed her hand flat against her rounded middle and smiled at him, and he put his hand to the doorframe and closed his eyes briefly and then opened them, and she knew that whatever Undone meant, it was the best kind. Their son was born in the second week of October, in the gray early morning after a long labor that Harlan spent in the hallway outside the bedroom door doing quiet structural damage to his own hands from gripping them together so hard. The doctor who came from Barlow Creek was competent and calm, and the midwife from the neighboring Thatcher Ranch was experienced and reassuring. And by the time the sun was fully up, there was a boy who was pink and furious about the world and perfectly healthy, and Myrtle was exhausted and radiant and had never felt more like herself. Harlan came into the room when they called him and stood beside the bed and looked at the baby and then at her and then at the baby again, and she could see him working to stay composed and not entirely succeeding. "He's all right," he said. "He's magnificent," the midwife said with professional satisfaction. "Good strong lungs, which you can probably hear." "He's like Eli was," Harlan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Myrtle held up the baby and Harlan took him with the careful practiced certainty of a man who had done this before and knew how fragile and how tough they were simultaneously. He held his son and something moved across his face that made everyone else in the room feel briefly like an intruder. "What are we calling him?" he said. They had discussed names. She had suggested James after her grandfather, who had been a steadfast and honest man. He had agreed immediately. "James," she said. "James Harlan Barlow." He looked at her over the baby's head, and she saw something in his eyes that made the whole exhausting night feel like the finest investment of her life. Clara and Eli were brought in an hour later. Clara was overcome with a reverent awe that expressed itself in total silence for a full minute before she exploded into a cascade of questions. Eli stood beside his father and looked at the baby with a complex 9-year-old's expression that slowly resolved into something clear and decided, and he said, "He's small." "He'll grow," Myrtle said. "I know," Eli said. He reached out with one careful finger and touched the baby's cheek. "Hi, James," he said quietly. James curled his tiny fist in response, as if acknowledging the introduction. Eli straightened up and cleared his throat and said, "I'll start planning what to teach him." "Not for a little while," Harlan said. "I know that," Eli said patiently. "I'm planning ahead." The winter that followed was the warmest winter she had known since arriving in Kansas, which had nothing to do with the weather. It was warm because the house was full of a kind of life that she recognized as the specific abundant warmth of a family that had come through difficulty together, and had found on the other side of it something that was not just happiness, but the deeper and more sustaining thing that happiness grows from. James was a vigorous baby who slept with athletic enthusiasm and woke with dramatic complaint, and had from his first weeks a way of becoming absolutely still and listening when Myrtle sang to him that she suspected was going to develop into a genuine musicality. Clara was convinced he was already the most intelligent baby in the history of Kansas. Eli maintained his position as the practical and realistic member of the family, but could occasionally be caught in unguarded moments making absurd faces at the baby and being utterly delighted by the results. Harlan was a father who could not quite believe his luck. She watched him with James with the same ache of love she had felt watching him with Clara and Eli, but compounded now by the knowledge that this one was theirs together, this particular new person who had Harlan's dark hair and her grandmother's stubborn chin. And when he held the baby in the evenings by the fire, she thought about all the losses that had preceded this and found, to her own wonder, that they did not diminish the present but somehow intensified it. She told him that one night, when the children were in bed and James was asleep in his cradle and they were sitting by the fire in the quiet, and he listened to her with his usual total attention and then said, "I've been thinking about Ellen lately. Not with grief exactly, though that's still there. More with a kind of gratitude that she was who she was and gave me who she gave me, and with the belief that she would want this for them, for all of them." "I believe that too," she said. "You've never competed with her memory," he said. "I noticed that from the beginning. You never tried to replace her or erase her. The children love her and they love you, and you never made those two things feel like they were in conflict." "They're not in conflict," she said. "Love isn't a fixed amount, it grows to accommodate." He looked at her across the fire. "Where did you learn that?" "From my grandmother," she said. "She was a very wise woman. She used to say that the heart was the one muscle that strengthened with use." "She was right," he said. Spring came to the Barlow Ranch in 1880 with a particular sweetness, the kitchen garden going in with cheerful industry, and the south pasture full of new calves, and the cedar brake putting out its pale green new growth against a sky that was so blue and so wide that it felt like a promise. James was learning to pull himself upright with grim determination, and Eli was teaching him to clap with the patient thoroughness he applied to all instructional endeavors. Clara had progressed in her music lessons to the point where she could read a simple melody from notation and play it on the small melodeon that Harlan had procured from a family selling up in the next county, and the evenings now sometimes included music that was played rather than just sung. Myrtle stood at the kitchen door one evening in late April, exactly 2 years and a handful of days from the afternoon she had first arrived with her carpetbag, and she looked out at the yard, where Harlan was walking with James held against his shoulder, showing the baby the horses and the barn, and the wide sky with the same careful attentiveness he gave to everything. The evening light was long and golden. The grassland ran to the horizon without a fence or a building to interrupt it. She thought about Wichita and about the boarding house and the $43 and the 2 years of careful living and the newspaper advertisement she had read 3 times in a stage depot. She thought about the ways the world had tried to make her small and afraid and temporary, and how she had refused, and how that refusal had brought her, by a route she could never have plotted in advance, to this particular evening light and this particular yard, and this man and these children and this life. Harlan turned from the horses and saw her in the doorway and lifted his hand in that spare, simple gesture of his, and she lifted hers in return. She went inside and found Clara at the melodeon picking out a melody with her careful small fingers, and Eli at the table with a book, reading with his usual intense concentration, and the supper on the stove smelling of everything good and ordinary. And she moved through the kitchen and set the table with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom these motions had become not just habit, but a kind of devotion. When Harlan came in with James, he settled the baby into the high chair that Pete had made over the winter from good cedar, a solid piece of craftsmanship that James had been enthusiastically battering with a wooden spoon since he got his hands and his opinions coordinated enough to manage it. Supper was full of the ordinary specific talk of a family, the accounts of the day, Eli's report on the condition of a particular fence section he had helped check with Tomas, Clara's progress on the new melody, James's vigorous and largely nonverbal commentary on the meal, which appeared to be mostly enthusiastic approval. After supper and after James was settled for the night, and after the supper dishes were done and the kitchen was quiet, Myrtle sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and her pen and wrote a letter to her sister in Missouri, the youngest one she had helped raise, who was married now with her own household and her own small children. And she wrote about her life with a fullness and specificity that she had not been able to write with in a long time, because, for a long time, she had not been able to say where she was or what she was doing without the shadow of the thing she was running from falling across the words. She wrote freely. She wrote about the ranch and the land and the children and the baby. She wrote about Harlan with the careful reticence of a woman who knows that some things are too interior for paper, but she wrote enough that her sister would understand. She wrote, toward the end of the letter, that she had thought for a long time that safety and love were in competition, that to have one you had to sacrifice the other, and that she had been wrong about this in a way that she was glad to have been proved wrong about. She sealed the letter and set it by the door for Tomas to take to town in the morning. Harlan came through the kitchen a few minutes later and stopped when he saw her at the table. "Everything all right," he said. "Everything is fine," she said. "I wrote to Francis." "Good," he said. He sat down across from her, which he did not always do this late, and she looked at him and thought that he looked tired in the good way, the way that comes from days that have been fully used. "I was thinking," he said, "about the north section. There's a good parcel of additional grazing land up there that's come available. The Hendersons are selling out and moving to Colorado. I've been looking at the numbers." She smiled. "Show me the numbers," she said. He got the ledger from the shelf, and she moved her chair around to his side of the table, and they sat together in the lamplight with the figures between them, going through the numbers with the particular pleasure of two people who were both serious about practical things, and who had discovered that shared practical engagement was its own form of intimacy. He was right about the grazing land. The numbers supported it. She showed him 2 places where they could free up the capital without damaging their operating reserves, and he followed her reasoning and agreed, and they made the decision together in the lamplight. And she thought that this was also one of the things that love was made of, this particular collaborative clarity. He put the ledger away, and she stood to begin banking the cook stove, and he came up behind her and put his arms around her and his chin against the top of her head. And they stood there for a moment in the warm kitchen with the night quiet and the house breathing around them. And she felt the absolute groundedness of a life that had been chosen and was being chosen again every day. "What are you thinking?" he said, his voice low against her hair. "I'm thinking about rivers," she said. "There's a song my grandmother sang about rivers and traveling and coming home. I used to sing it to the children." "I know the one," he said. "You still sing it sometimes." She said rivers were good to think about, Myrtle said, when things were uncertain, because rivers always know where they're going. They might curve and bend and take the long way, but they always arrive. "That's a good thing to think about," he said. "I thought so," she said. "I've been thinking about it for years, and I've arrived." He held her tighter. Outside, the Kansas night was wide and dark and full of stars, and the grassland stretched in every direction as far as any of them could see. In the children's room, Clara was asleep with her hand curled under her cheek and her melodeon leaning against the wall beside her bed, ready for tomorrow. In his cradle in the next room, James slept with the absolute physical commitment of a baby who has eaten well and is fully satisfied with the world. And Eli, in his narrow bed, had his hunting knife still under his pillow, but he slept more easily than he once had, and sometimes in the mornings Myrtle found it had worked its way further back, closer to the wall, further from easy reach, as though some part of him was deciding, slowly and on his own schedule, that the world did not require quite so much vigilance as he had thought. They would buy the north section in the fall. James would take his first steps in July, directly toward the horses, which would tell them everything they needed to know about him. Clara would perform her first public piece on the melodeon at the church social in August, a small and flawless rendition of a hymn that made 3 people cry. Eli would turn 11 in September and would be, by general agreement, the most competent fence checker and harness mender within a 10-mile radius of the ranch, and would receive this assessment with the studied nonchalance of someone who was privately very pleased. And Myrtle would sing to the children every night in the candle-lit room with Harlan in the doorway, and her heart full of the particular music of a life that had found its shape at last, a life that was safe and warm and true, built out of the wreckage of fear and the patient courage of 2 people who had each arrived at this piece of grassland carrying their losses and had chosen every morning to begin again. The river had arrived. The river was home. And every night the songs rose and fell in the dark house under the wide Kansas stars, steady and certain, and full of the specific happiness of things that have been earned.